The lights in the Tampa parking lot hummed the way they always do, steady, indifferent. It was past midnight, humid air clinging to glass and metal. A white SUV idled near the entrance of the Home 2 Suites, its headlights off, the faint rhythm of music bleeding from the cracked window. Somewhere inside, a man had just turned 26. His name was Charles Andrew Jones, though most only knew the version that belonged to the stage, Julio Foolio. He was looking for a place to stay, told to leave an Airbnb hours earlier for having too many people, too much noise. The celebration had ended, but not the noise. He stood by the door, phone in hand, his reflection swimming faintly in the tinted lobby glass. Across the lot, shadows shifted. A car door clicked, then another. In the seconds that followed, air turned to static. The first shots tore through the stillness, sharp, deliberate, echoing off the concrete like metal on stone. When the smoke settled, the night seemed to hold its breath again, a silence that didn't belong to peace, but to aftermath. Some said it was revenge, some said it was inevitable. What remains certain is that time did not stop for him that night. It simply kept moving, carrying the echoes of 30 bullets across the wet asphalt and into a city that had long forgotten how to sleep. The lot sat wide and flat, cut by pale lines that had faded under sun and rain. Sodium lights threw quiet cones across asphalt, leaving long areas of soft shadow between them. A sliding glass door faced the parking rows, the kind that opened with a muted motor and closed with a gentle seal. The sign above it read a name that travelers recognize from highway exits and business parks, Home 2 Suites. It was late, the kind of late that blurs dates on a phone screen. The man who approached the entrance had turned 26 hours earlier. He was here to book a room. He had been told to leave an Airbnb for exceeding the occupancy limit, and this, now, was the next available shelter. Bright lobby, clean floors, a small desk bell that rarely rings at this hour. A small group waited close to him, each holding the idle stillness that follows a long day. The air held heat, even at night, the way Florida does in June. A door to the lot slid open, then closed again. Vehicles idled. Somewhere, a compressor cycled on. From the road, occasional headlights moved past and dissolved. What happened next did not rise in volume. It arrived at full scale. Several men advanced with weapons, one carrying a pistol fitted with an extended magazine, others carrying rifles. The first flashes came fast. The rhythm was clipped, efficient. The magazine on the handgun allowed more than the usual capacity, and the shots continued past the count that a casual witness would expect. By the end, more than 30 rounds from the pistol alone had been fired. The rifles were fitted with brass catches, fabric or rigid housings fixed near the ejection ports, devices intended to retain spent casings as they cycle out. In the wash of muzzle flash and engine light, the lot became a geometry of angles and lines, doorway, curb, bumper, walkway, each a surface that sound struck and left. After the burst, there was the brief, unnatural quiet that follows rapid noise, then voices, then movement. People behind glass, people near cars, people on the phone explaining the address and the urgency. The automatic door waited for new motion, then closed on its own timer. Air conditioners kept running. A security camera, if one watched this entrance, would have recorded light fluctuating as figures crossed cones and returned to shadow. The man at the center of it had another name, a public one. Charles Andrew Jones, known professionally as Julio Foolio, was an American rapper from Jacksonville. Born June 21, 1998. Died June 23, 2024. Death by gunshot wounds. City of Death, Tampa, Florida. The entry reads like a ledger because ledgers are useful after the event. Who, where, when, cause. The rest, the years of work, the arguments that often precede violence, the patterns of threat and response, arrive later in reports and interviews. Here, at the scene, the facts are limited to what the lot and the people in it can show. 3 others were struck, wounded, in the same interval of time. Across the asphalt, the pattern where bodies fell and where bullets landed drew a diagram that investigators would measure. Distances from curb to door, from vehicle to entry, from first impact to final resting point. The tools for this work are simple: tape, markers, photographs, later the extraction of times from devices that keep their own clocks. In the first hour, the perimeter expands and contracts as officers trade speed for certainty, move the cones farther out, then bring them in as the outer ring is cleared. They ask for names, confirm spellings, call the county medical examiner, request building access, and if there is lobby footage, they note the time code offset against a phone's clock. The first interviews are short by necessity. The second and third are better. The details that would define headlines in the morning, the extended magazine on the handgun, the brass catchers on the rifles, say something quiet about intent. Extended capacity increases the number of shots between reloads, changing the spacing of time. Brass catchers manage what remains behind. For investigators, the absence or presence of spent casings becomes its own data point. The ground tells you what was used or what someone preferred not to leave behind. The lot remembers in small ways: the smell that lingers, the heat that hangs after the last flash. The victim had come to the hotel to secure a room after being removed from the Airbnb. That sequence matters because it explains proximity: why he is here, why now, why not somewhere else. The file, digital and physical, retains the shape of the night. The number of shooters, the weapons described, the count on that extended magazine, the decision to use brass catches, the path of the victim from one property to another in the span of hours. There are reasons why cities build hotels the way they do in these commercial corridors: access roads set back from major traffic, generous parking ratios, lights at a standard spacing, cameras oriented to doors in the elevators. Each of those decisions leaves a measurable trace in an investigation. Light angle can confirm a timestamp. The location of a bollard can confirm where a vehicle came to rest. Even the hum of a nearby highway enters the record indirectly. It can mask the distance at which shots are heard, changing who noticed what and when. In reconstruction, everything is scale and time: the speed at which feet cross distance, the number of frames between flashes, the way a magazine's capacity maps onto the gaps in sound. Later, the arrests in Jacksonville will supply structure to the names that first appeared as silhouettes in footage or as shapes on witness statements. They assign bodies to roles in a diagram that had been, for a few hours, only architecture and light and motion. But at this stage, the reconstruction remains spare and literal. A man who had just turned 26 sought a room at a hotel. Several assailants approached. A pistol with an extended magazine discharged more than 30 rounds. Rifles fitted with brass catchers were used. 3 others were wounded. The lot held the evidence the devices chose to leave. In reports, the time of death is written in numerals, the way timekeepers prefer: hour, minute, offset if needed. It fixes the frame for the first minutes of video if any exists: arrival, approach, conversation. The building envelope shapes the scene: a glass front, a covered entry against rain, a flat lot that gives long, low sight lines. It is the sort of place where you can see a person from 40 yards and recognize them by posture before you see their face. The same geometry that makes hotels feel safe to late arrivals also simplifies an approach for those who rather not be seen until they are close. Within an hour, the names of the wounded begin to sort, and the first consistent narrative takes form from converging accounts. The terminology stays careful: individuals described as suspects or persons of interest until an arrest is made. The earliest official statements often avoid theory. They establish what can be placed on a timeline and defer the why. In Tampa, leadership later described the murder as part of retaliation by rival gang members, a conclusion drawn from prior patterns, affiliations under observation, and the structure of the attack itself. On scene, however, the reconstruction keeps to geometry and time: approach, Interval, direction of travel, effects. By morning, the lot looks different only if you know where to look. The chalk or paint has been washed away or has faded. The cameras keep recording. The automatic door cycles on its motion sensor and admits guests with luggage and coffee. A maintenance worker checks the landscaping along the curb, careful around the trimmed edges. The place returns to its purpose. The location is given by street address, then city, county, and state. The cause is clinical and exact. The manner, a short list of possibilities, with one circled. These entries allow the case to join others in a database where queries can be run and patterns examined. They also allow the place to keep being a place. Guests arrive. Staff replace a fluorescent tube. A manager reviews a schedule. A door opens and closes. The reconstruction sits under all of that like an outline under tracing paper. If you look hard enough, you can see it. If you listen, the compressors still click on and off at regular intervals. What remains from the first hours is not a conclusion, but a shape. The shape is built from lines that do not argue. The distance between door and curb, the velocity implied by a body's position relative to a trajectory, the count of shots supported by capacity and report, the devices attached to weapons that decide what evidence the ground will hold. The work of reconstruction ends when those lines can be placed in order without disagreement. It does not explain the reasons. It does not take a side. It describes a night that began with small ordinary decisions, leave one address, seek another, and ended with a record that fits inside a folder and a few minutes of video. Everything else belongs to the sections that follow. They logged the direction of each bullet impact, each shattered glass fragment. The reports later would read like coordinates, but in the field, every step was guesswork dressed as geometry. By dawn, the lot was covered in evidence markers, small yellow tents that looked almost harmless in the morning light. Crime scene photographers moved between them, documenting scale, distance, and angle. Each photo became a timestamp of silence. Officers traced the camera timestamps against surveillance footage from the hotel lobby. A pattern began to form. At 1:47 a.m., movement near the entryway. At 1:49, the flash. By 1:51, silence again. Less than 4 minutes of chaos. Inside the hotel, guests who had seen nothing were still interviewed. The human memory of violence is rarely accurate, but every contradiction has value. Inconsistencies reveal time gaps, and time gaps reveal truth. One woman on the third floor recalled hearing metal tapping, like tools. Another thought it was fireworks. A man claimed he saw 3 figures in hoodies running past the window, though none could agree on their direction. Memory folds on itself quickly after shock. Investigators learned to read between the folds. Back in Jacksonville, names began to surface through databases already marked by years of recurring violence. KTA and ATK, 2 rival sets locked in a cycle of retaliation that had blurred the line between music and war. It was not about lyrics anymore. It was about survival. Foolio had lived in that overlap, his songs echoing events too close to reality. The feuds had left a long digital trail, posts, comments, replies. Words turned into coordinates, and coordinates turned into bodies. Cold, calm crime narration, neutral British active flow. Police analysts traced those exchanges, noting timestamps, addresses, vehicles. Behind every feud was a map. When detectives reached Foolio's family, the conversation was quiet. His mother had said publicly that she blamed the music, the fame, the noise that followed him everywhere. She wanted justice, but understood that justice in this city came slower than headlines. Detectives listened, nodded, and left her house with a folder that would eventually grow thick enough to stand upright on its own. In Tampa, the homicide team reconstructed timelines from fragments of digital life. Foolio's last Instagram story showed celebration, a cake, a hotel view, laughter. Minutes later, the feed went dark. The police requested metadata, cell phone pings, hotel registration logs. The clerk who had spoken to him recalled nothing unusual. She said he seemed calm, just wanted a room. Calmness often precedes catastrophe. Every gun leaves a pattern. Ballistic specialists began comparing recovered projectiles against known weapons from prior Jacksonville shootings. One bullet had a distinct lands and grooves pattern, 6 right twist rifling marks consistent with an AR-style rifle. Another had deformation suggesting a hollow point round fired from a modified Glock. Each clue pulled the chain tighter, linking one event to a longer series. Violence, like sound, echoes through structure. By the third day, forensic analysts had extracted enough data to establish the attack's geometry. 3 shooters, coordinated positioning, and a controlled interval of engagement lasting under 15 seconds. 32 shots from one handgun, 10 to 12 from each rifle. The precision was military in form, street-born in purpose. When suspects were arrested months later, they were found in Jacksonville, young men aged between 18 and 30, connected through networks that blurred music production, loyalty, and retribution. Their names filled the gaps left open since that night. The details of the ambush were read aloud in court filings. Foolio had arrived to check into the hotel. Within minutes, the shooter's car followed, weapons concealed, headlights off. One waited near the door, another by the vehicle exit. For investigators, the puzzle's end was never resolution, only confirmation. They learned what they already knew, that retaliation travels faster than understanding, and that the violence that started years earlier had found one more endpoint in a parking lot. When the reports were finalized, they read with the same still rhythm as the night itself. Location: Home 2 Suites, Tampa, Florida. Victim: Charles Andrew Jones II. Time: shortly after 1:47 a.m. Cause: homicide by gunshot wounds. Method: ambush-style shooting involving multiple assailants armed with rifles and handguns. Motive: ongoing gang retaliation. Evidence: recovered projectiles, surveillance footage, and digital correspondence. The words were neat, the tone clinical, but under the paperwork, the weight remained, the unrecorded hum of lights that still flickered over the spot where sound had once folded into silence. The investigation traced facts, but beneath those lines was something less measurable, a life lived inside a constant low hum of threat. Julio Foolio's world had been stitched together from music, rivalry, and survival. He came from Jacksonville's Moncrief neighborhood, where the geography of blocks often determined a direction of a future. Violence there didn't arrive as surprise, it grew in repetition. Each shooting became another post, another lyric, another name folded into the music. He was born into loss. His father was murdered when he was 13. A cousin was killed 5 years later. Death entered his songs before fame ever did. In interviews, he spoke of it almost as a routine. Visits to jail, hospital rooms, and vigils. He called it normal life. But normalcy built on trauma turns into vigilance. Every sound becomes data. Every car slowing at the corner feels like pattern recognition. As his fame spread through Jacksonville's drill scene, so did the scope of danger. Rival groups recorded diss tracks naming each other's dead. In this world, words were not art, they were coordinates. The songs moved faster than bullets, shared through feeds that never slept. When Foolio mocked the victims of a rival crew online, it was more than provocation. It was an announcement. It marked him in the open. Each upload became a form of exposure, each view a possible sightline. The human mind adapts strangely to threat. At first it anticipates, then it accepts. Eventually, it integrates the possibility of death into daily rhythm. He spoke once about how he carried his gun everywhere, how he slept light, how he expected to be targeted. The pattern of fear had become maintenance. Not panic, but preparation. Fear kept him alive, familiarity made him careless. The killings in Jacksonville had followed a rhythm. One death, then a reply, then another reply disguised as a song. Between 2017 and 2024, dozens of shootings traced back to that invisible feud. For outsiders, it was noise. For those inside, it was sequence. The feuds blurred music and murder until they became the same story told in alternating verses. Foolio's lyrics mirrored that descent. His 2019 mixtape, Never Wanted Fame, read like prophecy. Loss, paranoia, inevitability. The titles of his later albums, Final Destination and Resurrection, carried irony that hindsight sharpens. By 2023, attempts on his life had multiplied. He was shot in Houston, shot again in Jacksonville. Each survival became another layer of confidence, proof to him that fate owed him more time. But the psychology of survival has limits. Living through danger too long dulls the boundary between chance and control. You start to mistake luck for immunity. When he posted in early 2024 about the multiple attempts on my life, there was fatigue in the words. He had learned to expect repetition, but not escape. That's the hidden cost of endless alertness. The mind stops seeking peace. It only measures distance between risks. Even celebration becomes exposure. A birthday party, a hotel, a night that feels earned. But the pattern does not forget. It waits for vulnerability, disguised as calm. The descent is not loud. It is made of tiny accommodations, changing routes, scanning faces, carrying more protection than comfort. Psychologically, he was cornered long before that night in Tampa. Fame amplified his face, music traced his address, algorithms repeated his name to anyone who might hate it. Visibility became vulnerability. When the shooters came, they weren't chasing mystery. They were completing a sentence that had started years earlier. Their motive was arithmetic, one life for another, a pattern disguised as justice. In their minds, it wasn't crime, it was correction. Violence inside these cycles often hides behind the illusion of balance. What remains most chilling is not the act itself, but how routine it had become. How a young man could live expecting death and still keep performing for cameras. It reveals something about environment and adaptation. That survival can feel like purpose, and danger can masquerade as identity. Foolio's calm in interviews, his jokes about near misses, his refusal to leave Jacksonville despite repeated warnings, all of it pointed to a fatal normalization of threat. Psychological descent rarely looks like breakdown. It looks like endurance, mistaken for strength. He was not reckless, he was tired. The calm before his death was not peace, it was acceptance. When he walked toward that hotel door after midnight, phone in hand, it was not carelessness, it was resignation. By the time the investigation reconstructed his final hours, the emotional arc was already clear. Every feud, every post, every track had built toward a moment where predictability replaced chance. The line between choice and fate blurred until it vanished. What killed him was not only a gun, but a system of meaning that made the gun inevitable. And so, beneath the headlines and reports, there lies a quieter truth, a psychological exhaustion that turned vigilance into habit and habit into surrender. The descent did not happen that night. It had been unfolding for years, measured not in bullets, but in how calmly he learned to live with their echo. The next morning, headlines appeared across Florida. Rapper Julio Foolio killed in Tampa ambush. The phrasing was uniform, factual, concise. A single sentence distilling a life into an event. For most readers, it was another story in a stream of breaking alerts. But for the city of Jacksonville, it was a continuation. Police tape came down, but the investigation didn't. Within days, names surfaced: Alicia Andrews, Isaiah Chance Jr., Sean Garthright, and Rashad Murphy. Each name carried its own geography, neighborhoods already known to officers, patterns already logged in databases. They were all young, connected through the same lattice of loyalty and hostility that had mapped Foolio's career. 6 months later, a final arrest closed the circle. Davion Murphy, found in a Jacksonville apartment after months on the run. The city's silence about him was not surprise. It was fatigue. In Tampa, the detectives wrote their closing reports with careful syntax. The homicide was marked as solved through arrests, not yet adjudicated. The narrative section read with the dryness of official memory. Suspects approached in multiple vehicles, opened fire, fled the scene, later apprehended in coordinated operation. Beneath that summary, a note about retaliation, a reference to the gang feud that had spanned a decade. The courtroom, when it came, would be quieter than the streets that had produced the case. There would be no music, no digital noise, only transcripts and the weight of sequence. Prosecutors would describe a retaliation chain that began years earlier with a cousin's death, then a response, then a post, then a reply track, every cycle repeating with new names and old reasons. It was less a feud than a pattern learned too well. For Foolio's family, the ritual of aftermath began in familiar order: funeral arrangements, statements, news cameras outside the church. His mother spoke once, briefly, saying that rapping had brought him both fame and danger, that she wanted justice but not revenge. The funeral took place at Edgewood Cemetery, under a heat that made the air shimmer. Cameras stayed at a respectful distance, zoom lenses bridging silence with intrusion. His fans mourned in the language the internet knows best, looping clips, remixes, captions, emojis that substitute for grief. They filled comments with words like legend and taken too soon, though many of them had once watched his online conflicts as if they were serialized entertainment. The boundary between empathy and voyeurism had blurred long ago. In Jacksonville, the police department held a briefing days after the murder, emphasizing ongoing monitoring of clashing groups. The words were careful, as if the violence were weather, something to observe rather than prevent. Local reporters framed the death as the latest in a series of retaliations that had already claimed dozens of young men, most of them musicians. There was talk of intervention programs, mentorship, new policing strategies. Then the cameras turned off and the cycle continued. The physical traces of the night were eventually erased. The parking lot resurfaced, the glass doors cleaned, the security footage stored and backed up, another file among thousands. But the emotional residue lingered, in his friends' posts, in his unfinished songs, in the constant hum of fear that stretched across Jacksonville's rap community. The city moved on, but not forward. In the months that followed, Foolio's streaming numbers spiked. Death has always been an amplifier. His final album, Resurrection, became a kind of echo chamber, a work recorded months before his death that listeners now treated as prophecy. Lines about mortality and betrayal acquired new weight, as if he had written them knowing the ending. Audiences searched for foreshadowing in his lyrics, for hidden meanings that might make the senseless logical. But art, once released, belongs to interpretation. Truth dissolves into replay. For investigators, the aftermath settled into maintenance, court filings, evidence logs, witness preparation. Each hearing was procedural, language stripped of emotion. Every testimony reopened the same minute of violence from new angles, until even memory grew tired of the retelling. The defense spoke of influence, pressure, fear. The prosecution spoke of planning, retaliation, execution. Between them lay the empty middle where motive loses its shape. On social media, the feud didn't die with him. It fragmented. Smaller artists referenced the case in lyrics, posts, and lives, keeping the narrative alive under new names. Each reference was another echo in a room with no walls. Violence, once cultural, had become content. The city's night rhythm didn't change. Cars still moved along the same routes. People still locked doors at the same hours. What changed was awareness, a recognition that danger had become part of the landscape, not anomaly but pattern. The murder was tragic, yes, but not unique. It joined a ledger already full. By the first anniversary of his death, Tampa police had filed all remaining reports. The case was officially complete, but closure isn't the same as conclusion. The families still lived within the orbit of the event. Foolio's family in grief, the suspects' families in denial or exhaustion. Both sides carried silence differently, one as loss, the other as waiting. The aftermath stretched beyond geography. In interviews months later, other rappers from Jacksonville spoke in tones of weariness, not fear but resignation. "It don't end," one said. "We just try to live longer than the last one." That sentence, more than any headline, captured what remained. Because aftermath is not measured in justice or arrests, it's measured in quiet, the absence of sound where sound once was. The Tampa parking lot, resurfaced and repainted, holds no trace of blood or smoke, but under its new asphalt lies the memory of sequence. A man searching for a room, headlights off, and the echo of 30 shots fading into air too thick to breathe. Time, in the end, flattens everything. The hotel stands where it always stood. Rooms are booked, cleaned, and booked again. Cars move through the same parking lot without pause. No one looking from a distance would know that a man once died here, that the quiet hum of its lights once carried the echo of 30 rounds. The world doesn't erase tragedy, it just repurposes the space. What remains are fragments, not of evidence, but of understanding. A mother's voice on local news, trembling yet steady. A crowd of fans replaying old clips, mistaking repetition for remembrance. A file stored on a detective's hard drive, labeled with a date and a name. These pieces don't fit into closure, they only coexist with time. There's a kind of silence that grows after the noise fades, not peace, but fatigue. The city lives in that silence now. Jacksonville has seen too many funerals that look the same white doves, the same words of faith, the same disbelief that never fully fades. Violence has a rhythm, and after a while, so does grief. In the broader sense, Foolio's story isn't unique. It mirrors an entire generation of young men raised in sound and survival, their art documenting what institutions failed to fix. His lyrics were not predictions, they were records. Each line carried the weight of neighborhoods where safety is temporary and identity is proof of endurance. He didn't glorify danger so much as normalize it, because in his world, danger was the baseline. That is what makes the story cold and calm and endlessly repeating. The systems around him, music, media, the city itself, absorbed his fear, monetized his image, and then moved on. The coverage ends where it began, with his name, his birth date, and the word homicide. The moral lines stay blurred because this is not a tale of innocence or guilt, it's a portrait of inevitability. What we call crime often begins long before the act itself, in broken trust, in inherited anger, in an economy that rewards performance over peace. Each bullet that night carried not just metal, but history, each name in the case a continuation of an old conversation no one has yet learned to stop. And so the reflection ends where the hook began, in stillness. A man standing beneath artificial light, unaware that the last moment of quiet in his life was also the world's final mercy to him. The camera footage, the forensic maps, the court transcripts, they all describe motion. But beneath them lies something motionless, the quiet certainty that nothing about this story is isolated. Because the truth is not in the crime, nor in the fame, nor even in the aftermath. The truth lies in the repetition, the kind that makes tragedy ordinary. In the end, Foolio's death is not just one story among many, It is the sound of a system breathing, slow and heavy, pretending to sleep. The night took him quickly, but the echo it left behind moves slower, through memory, through music, through every young artist who still believes that fame can be armor. The light above that parking lot hums the same steady note. It has no emotion, no bias, no pause. It simply stays on.